Hello, gear nerds of the internet. You might be asking yourself, what is this big black box? This, my friends, is a subwoofer. Why did I buy a subwoofer? Well, I actually bought two subwoofers. I bought this one and another one. Keep watching for the review on that one in the same video, because I'm going to compare these in a two-channel system. So why did I decide to buy subwoofers? Well, I've been actually hesitant to even consider subwoofers for the longest time, because I sort of feel like they're cheating a little bit. And maybe that's not accurate, but that's how I feel, and sometimes feelings are irrational. And that all sort of changed when I received my newest stereo amplifier, the Raven Nighthawk, that has a sub out that actually has a built-in low pass filter, so it will run a sub directly out. I guess we need to talk about what that crossover does. So what that crossover does, as I kick the camera, or what any crossover does, I guess, is you're basically diverting frequencies to where you want them to go. In the case of the subwoofer, or in the case of the Raven, what it's doing is it has two different options at 80 hertz. Everything above 80 hertz is going to your speakers, and then anything lower than 80 hertz is going to the subwoofer. It also has a 100 hertz option as well. It does the same thing. Diverts 100, above 100, below 100, 100 below 100 goes to the subwoofer. Why I find that fascinating, or why I found it fascinating enough to actually consider buying and then actually buying subwoofers to compare, is that that's a significantly better way to do it compared to the other options that you usually get, where you're sending 100% of your frequencies to your speakers and then you're rolling off, or you're crossing over, but really what you're doing is rolling off the frequencies at the subwoofer that you don't want it to play. At least that's how I understand it. I'm not a subwoofer guy. This is just how I understand it. And maybe I have it wrong. And if I have it wrong, let me know. But near as I can tell, that's all you're doing. The crossover, because you're not diverting those high frequencies. You're just rolling them off so that this is only playing the frequencies you want to hear. And then, so why that to me is not ideal is because now you're having potentially, I guess if you get that roll off or that crossover right, you're not overlapping any frequencies, but the odds are you still might be. And to me, what makes what the Nighthawk is doing so interesting is that I'm taking my KEF R300s and no longer am I trying to push lower frequencies, so it doesn't have to worry about that. It only has to worry about the mid-range frequencies and the high frequencies, which makes it easier on those speakers. Because if you ever watch a speaker, a bass will extrude that cone significantly because it needs a lot of power to push out and make that sound. Once you're removing that from your bookshelves, theoretically, your bookshelves are going to sound better because they're not going to have to compete with those low frequencies. And then your subwoofer is going to be doing that heavy lifting. And that's why I find that what I like that the Raven Nighthawk does is good enough to where I'm like, yeah, I want to try that. I want to see what that's like. Because the way that my speakers are set up, I sort of struggle with the bass sometimes. And if I could get that bass out of where I have to have my bookshelf speakers and get that, and if I can get that into another area of the room, and then that doesn't have to put out those bass frequencies, then that's going to make that'll nullify that situation where I'm getting bass boom out of the bookshelves. That brings us to the SVS. So you can see it's a big box. It has a big speaker. Man, this looks like it's 12 inches, but I think it's only 10 inches. Let's measure it. It is 12 inches, so it's this 12-inch subwoofer, which is bigger than I thought it was. I thought this was smaller, but look at me not paying attention. Oh, so this is the SBS 1000 Pro. And you can see this thing grabs every little piece of hair and fuzz imaginable. So this is a pretty substantially sized box. You can maybe see that it has this like wood wrap looking stuff. It's not particularly great looking. Let's look at the back of this. All right, so this is the back. You can see you have your on off, you have your power input, you can plug this directly into your speaker outputs. But then again, at that point, you're still sending 100% of your frequencies to this and your speakers. And then, well, we'll talk about this in a second, but then you're modifying what frequencies you actually care about this, and then you're still sending all your frequencies to your speakers. You have input and output. So I'm guessing that you could go in here and cross over and then go out here. Like if you're running a separate or a integrated that has a preamp out and then a power amp in, I believe, don't take my word on this because I didn't research this. I didn't look at this functionality because I wasn't using it. And I have well, I guess I could theoretically have a reason to use it, but I'm not. So you have your input, which is what I use. I use these two because the Raven has 2 RCA outs for the subwoofer out. And I imagine that then you can, like I said, you take a preamp, put your preamp in here, and you go out to your power amp here and then do the crossover. As you can see, there's not a lot of options here. That is because you can connect this to your phone via Bluetooth, and you can do all kinds of changes on the fly. You can change its volume, you can change its phase, which I kind of don't understand. So what the phase is, as speakers have polarity, right? It has plus and a minus, and if you're using more than one speaker, you want them to be in phase where they're both moving at the same time. If you take one speaker and put positive to positive and negative to negative, and on this one you put negative to positive, positive and negative, then when this one pushes out, this one's going to suck in, and what that does effectively is kills frequencies. Usually in the low end, you get a kind of weird, sound. Somehow this manages to, you can modulate the phase. I don't even know if modulate's the right word for this. But so normally you're either in phase, which would be 0 degrees, or 180, which would be out of phase. Somehow you can, with this, change the phase to 90 or more or less, which to me seems like, it's a concept to me of like being a little bit pregnant. Like either you're pregnant or you're not, either you're in phase or you're out of phase. I don't know how that works. And frankly, I'm not interested enough to figure it out to actually look into it. So I don't know. If you know how that works, I'm guessing it's just using some sort of device, some circuit to approximate what it would sound like in these different phase ranges. I can't imagine that it's actually you know, 72% out of phase. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. But again, I'm stupid, so what do I know? It also has like presets. So if you're using this with a home theater, you could set it to movie, you could set it to music. So I set it to music. What I found was this thing put out a lot of bass. Too much bass for my room, too much bass for my speakers. What the music setting is negative 10 dB. What I found was as I went down in volume, at around like minus 17 dB, you started sort of losing the bass note, and you were keeping the low end frequency, which is kind of not what I would have wanted. I would have rather, you know, keep the bass note and lose the lower end frequency. So I found this to be kind of useless in my setup, quite frankly. I also found that having all of these options where you're constantly playing, like, oh, let me mess around with the phase, let me mess around with the volume. The more options I have, the more distracted I'm going to be, the less enjoyment I'm going to get out of something. If you're that sort of person, I would recommend steering away from something like this, because you're going to constantly be fiddling, constantly looking for a better setup, and you're never going to just sit there and enjoy the music or the movies or whatever you use this for. So that is essentially my review. The bass sounded, I don't know, bassy, not particularly refined. I should say I also bought these, which I never actually used. You screw these into on the bottom there, there's under here that you can't see. Maybe you could see if I lifted it up. There are rubber spikes. Those easily screw out, and then you can screw in these. These are rubber feet. Let's open them up and see what they look like. No, we're not going to bother because this is sealed. And this is going to go back, and there's no point. But it's basically like a round, soft donut sort of foot that sits under here, and then it isolates some of the vibrations, so it's not, as this is doing its thing, it's not vibrating into the floor, so it's not using that to overly excite the bass. And I'm going to guess that also allows this to run smoother. That's, you know, the claim. That would make sense. Why they don't just put this on there or include it for 50, like, I don't know. Why would you make someone buy that extra? Just increase the cost by a little bit and include it. But who knows? So yeah, I'm going to grab the other one I bought. I'll be back in a second. For you, it'll be no time at all. For me, it will be me carrying this back up the stairs and bringing the other one down, which is fun in a 100-year-old house with rickety-ass basement stairs. Yay. See you in a minute. And we are back with my other subwoofer that I bought. This is a REL T5X. As you can see, that, you know, you can see the TV screen that I use to make sure that this thing is in focus, this thing being the camera that you can kind of maybe see. It has a mirrory shine. It doesn't have spikes like the SVS. This has slightly padded feet. It has no speaker here. It does say REL on the top. Whereas that one collected every bit of dust and hair on the front, this thing would collect fingerprints, which is whatever, and dust and hair, because everything, you know, everything is attracted to everything. So you're asking yourself, where does the bass come out of? Well, it comes out of down there. So that guy is a smaller speaker. Let's see if I can. Let's measure that. Let's get some of this gross hair from my dog off the bottom of this. Anyone have a dog that just sheds all over the place? So this is an 8-inch subwoofer. So this is going to put out significantly less low end than the SVS, which, depending on your use case, is a good thing or a bad thing. I guess in my circumstance, it would be a good thing, maybe? Let's discuss that more in a minute. So let's look at the back of this guy. So this guy, although it's a bit smaller than the SVS, and it's a bit prettier in my opinion, it's heavier by a little bit, not by a ton, but it's definitely heavier. So what you have back here is a heatsink, audiophile ASMR. You have your phase switch, which basically in or out of phase, as we discussed earlier. You have this if you want to hook up your computer device circa 1989. I don't know what that's doing there. I could read the manual and find out, but I'm not particularly interested. You have a speak-on speaker input. This is what it uses to connect directly to your speaker outputs. You have a low level input, and then you have a low 0.1 LFE input. So when I thought was thinking about purchasing this thing, I reached out to REL because, as I stated previously, the Raven has 2 RCA outs for my sub, and this has one here and one there, which confused me. I'm like, well, what do I do? Do I get a Y cable to connect and turn those stereo into essentially a mono and then plug it into one of these? And if so, which one do I plug it into? So I reached out to REL support. In about a day, they got back to me and they said, I want to plug it into this guy. And I said, okay, cool. And they said, yeah, do the Y cable thing. So I got it and I plugged it into this guy. And it wasn't making hardly any noise. Like, you could feel the woofer cone moving. It was barely moving. It was like barely putting out any juice at all. So I'm like, well, that's not right. So then I moved to this guy, and that one worked. So I emailed REL back, and I was like, WTF, REL? Like, you told me to use this one, but like that one doesn't work for that. And I explained, like, hey, this has a subwoofer out that has a built-in low-pass filter, a built-in crossover that is, you know, doing its own low-pass filtering. So I don't need this. Like, this crossover part to me is meaningless because I'm not using that functionality. I'm getting that functionality from my amplifier. And they said, yes, use this. And then, so I reached out to them again, saying, what gives? This one works, that one doesn't. And they said that if I plug it into this, I then have to increase this crossover, which at that point, it seems like I'm doubling the crossover effect, which doesn't seem like something worthwhile doing. So I believe this one assumes that you already have the crossover built in. And then so they said to use this one or use that one. What kind of support is this, REL? Really? This device is not inexpensive. It's $700. And you should know how, and there's not a lot of functionality, guys. There is 3 knobs and 3 inputs, and you should, and there's only so many ways to hook one of these things up. I mean, then there's that thing, but you know, who knows? Maybe, I'm sure they don't know what that thing is either. If they don't know how these things work, they definitely don't know what that serial port is doing back there. Anyway, so once I plugged into here and I attenuated the volume to where I found it to be most desirable, it sounded pretty good. I liked, for my setup, this worked much better than the SVS. And my setup being bookshelf speakers with, in a smallish room, I think it's about 10 by 20. It's 10 wide. The speakers are like there, and then it goes back 20, 23, 20 something feet. And my listening, it's not that back all the way. It's maybe 6 feet away from where the speakers are. So this thing seemed to do what I wanted it to do, a put out bass. Didn't overwhelm or muddy up or step on the mid-range and the highs. Whereas I found the SVS did that. When I'm listening to the music, you're hearing the bass with the SVS. Like, that's the front and foremost thing. And like I said, if I turn that down, I'm losing the bass note, and I'm maintaining the subsonic-ish. It's probably not subsonic because I could hear it, but, you know, the real low end is kind of staying there. And had I realized, and I'm sure I looked at it, but for some reason I didn't realize that the SVS used a 12-inch woofer. I thought it used a 10-inch woofer. And this being an 8, I thought they were relatively equivalent, but obviously, had I known that, I would have maybe found an SVS that had an 8-inch woofer or a 10-inch woofer or something smaller than a 12. A 12-inch woofer is relatively huge, especially for a smallish, even a larger size room. So I guess, like, if you're using this in a room, let's say 300 square feet or less, I would go with something like this with an 8-inch woofer. The SVS would work better probably with tower speakers in a larger room. How big of a room? Like, any size room, really. Like, so this is what's crazy. So the difference between this is a 4 inches on the woofer. The SVS uses a 12-inch woofer. And if you go to a concert, those are using 15-inch on the subs at the concert. They're using 15-inch subwoofers. So that's only a 3-inch difference. So the difference between this and the difference between the SVS is bigger than the difference between the SVS and Pro Audio, essentially. Like, that's a lot. That's pushing a lot of air. I mean, for music, unless you're running like in a really big room with those really big those is it Heresies, the ones that look like PA speakers? Anything like any normal sort of bookshelf, you're gonna want to stick with something. And my experience is again limited to this and the SVS. You're gonna want to stick to something 10 inches, 8 inches, something like this. So the bass is also more refined on this REL than the SVS. The SVS, the bass was bigger, obviously, but it sounded a little less nice. They're bass frequencies, so like it's hard to really call it nice. But these seemed a little bit. I mean, they're less punchy, obviously, because it's a less bass, bit less getting pushed out of there, but it just sounds more refined than the SVS. The SVS sounds like a cheaper subwoofer, even though this is only $100 more than the SVS. So they're relatively the same price-ish. And that just might because there's less bass. Maybe that's the reason that it sounds more refined, because there's less, and so it's easier to sound good when you're doing something less, right? Like, anyway. So what I haven't used is this, and I'm kind of curious about that. And maybe I'll do a second follow-up video where I plug some of my other amps. I have 3 tube amps and the Vidar. Maybe I'll plug that into this and see how it goes. But like I said, honestly, I feel like the best use case for a subwoofer in at least a 2-channel setup is where you're offloading the lows entirely through a crossover at your amplifier rather than basically rolling off the frequencies with this crossover. That is less efficient and effective in terms of what it's doing. And I mean, I'm sure it's going to put out more bass. But what it's not going to do is it's not going to clean up the bass notes coming out of my bookshelves, because the bass notes are still going to be going to my bookshelves. So, I mean, I guess this would work if you have like something like a real small, like the Musical Paradise MP301 tube amp. It's like 2 single tube Class A tube amp, where it sounds, in my system, I had one, it sounded like an AM radio. You plug that in, that might help out. You might be able to, that might be awesome with this, because it's definitely not sending low end to the speakers, or if it is, the speakers aren't able to put it out, because even in my higher, they're 89 dB efficient Kefs, that didn't work, but maybe it would work now. Maybe I'll have to revisit that amplifier with this possibility. If I keep this at all, I still have to do more A/B, turning it off, listening to just the bookshelves, turning it back on, because this thing is $700. That's a lot of money. I really want to get some sort of real big improvement in quality. You know. So, guys, let me know what you think. Have you tried both of these? Now that I realize that it's not an apples to apples, it's like an apples to pears, sort of. Not even. Apples to pears, probably closer than, this is like an apples to banana. Like, this is an apple and the other one's a banana. I feel dumb. But I also feel like these are sort of the two competing subwoofers, right? Like, they're sort of ish the same price. I don't know. It seems like that's what people... maybe I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot, guys. Subscribe to an idiot talking about gear, please. Have a good day.